My coworker, who was also my best friend, had just bought a new gaming PC and kept talking about it all week. I couldn't afford anything like that, so he offered to lend me his old setup. He said I could come by and grab it whenever since I had a key to his place. It was a little after 11 p.m. one night when I walked over to his apartment to grab it. That night my friend was still working for one more hour. He lived in the next building over, maybe a 3-minute walk. When I got to his place, the door was unlocked already. He did have a bit of a bad habit of not locking the door when he left, so I assumed he had done that yet again. I went into the living room where his gaming computer was set up so I could grab the old PC. When I entered the living room, I saw an older man was sitting in the recliner just reading a book. He looked strange, but he didn't look like a drifter. No one else had a key to my friend's place, so I knew right away this guy didn't belong. His eyes had this crazy look that I will never forget, like they were detached from reality. He turned to look at me, and I felt my blood go cold. He just smiled at me and closed the book. He stared at me like that for a few seconds before standing up and opening his arms out like he wanted a hug. I totally forgot about the PC, and I just sprinted out the door back towards my apartment after he started coming towards me for a hug. When I got back to my place, I called 911, and I stayed on the line with the dispatcher as they told me to lock myself in my room. Not long after, I heard a knock on my door for a few seconds before nothing. My bed is in the middle of my room, and the head of my bed is right underneath a window on ground level. I stupidly sat up against the window, wanting to see my whole room. I had my pocket knife with me, and I was holding it tightly in my hands as I sat in panicked silence. Suddenly, directly behind me, I heard a loud crashing noise as the crazy man broke my window from my backyard. I felt his arm then wrap around my neck as he started dragging me through my broken window, the shards of glass cutting into my skin. I slashed and stabbed my knife behind me blindly, and I heard the man curse in pain as his grip loosened. I stabbed his arm a couple times before wriggling myself from his grasp. Thankfully, the police arrived quickly, and they managed to get there as he was still dealing with the pain from the stab wounds in his arm, and the police managed to tackle him as he tried to run. The man was cuffed and placed in a patrol car, and I was taken to the hospital for the injuries I sustained from the glass on my window. The man didn't talk much at all before going to jail, and he said nothing useful. Neither me nor my best friend knew the man, but we assumed that he was there waiting for my friend to come home and had his plan screwed up by me going to get the gaming computer. It was late 2021 when I moved into a small rental on the edge of town after changing jobs. I was a guy living on my own, and the place belonged to a coworker's uncle who had moved into an assisted living place, so the house had been sitting empty for a while. The rent was cheap, and it was only about a 30-minute drive to work, so I didn't ask too many questions. I just agreed to keep the place in decent shape and cover utilities. The house itself was nothing special. 2 floors, 2 bedrooms, a small yard, and a detached garage that I didn't really use. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly older people, and there was not much traffic at night. About a week in, I noticed the side gate to the back door was open when I got home from work. I was pretty sure I had latched it that morning because I usually double-check things like that. I walked around the yard thinking maybe the wind pushed it open, even though it was one of those heavier wooden gates. Nothing else seemed off, so I closed it and didn't think too much about it. A few days later, I found it open again. This time, I was sure I had shut it properly before leaving. I checked around the yard more carefully, but didn't see anything missing or out of place. I figured maybe the latch was loose or broken, so I tied it shut with a bit of wire I found in the garage. The next morning, the wire I had used on the gate was untwisted and loose, and the gate was open again. I started thinking maybe someone was cutting through the yard for some reason and didn't know that the house was being lived in. It didn't make much sense though, since there was nothing behind the house except for another fenced property. I retied the gate, this time tighter, and left for work. That evening, I decided to check the garage since I hadn't really gone in there much. When I opened it, I noticed a couple of things had been moved around. There was an old chair that had been against the wall and was now closer to the door, and a small box of cardboard I remembered seeing in the corner was open. I started to think that there was a squatter who had been living on the property or in the garage while the place had been unattended. Maybe they didn't know I was living there now, or maybe they just didn't care. I called the owner and asked him if anybody else had access to the place. He said no, it was just me. That night, I was watching a show at 1 a.m. when I was surprised to hear the chattering of voices nearby. I listened intently, but couldn't hear what they were talking about as their voices seemed almost muffled and quiet. By this point, I was getting a bit unnerved, so I stopped the movie and quietly got off my sofa and walked to the front door to make sure that it was locked. As I was approaching the door, I froze mid-step as I heard the two people approaching my porch and reducing their talking to a whisper. I realized right away that these people wanted to break in. I leaned against the front door and waited, expecting a loud bang against the door or the doorknob to be shaken, but it was oddly quiet. I decided to walk over to my window to see if they had walked away or changed their minds. My windows have bars from the inside out that you have to unlock so that you can move the curtains or look out the window comfortably. I slowly unlocked the bar mechanism and lifted it up. I moved the curtains then and was taken aback to see that leaning up against my window was a man. He was as startled as I was, and he tightened his hoodie over his face so all I could really see were his eyes looking at me. His friend realized what was going on and right away started to kick the door in. He kicked it a solid 4 or 5 times, but the door wouldn't budge. All the while I was staring at them frozen in fear, trying to comprehend the situation. I snapped out of it and slammed the bars over my window, locked them, and then ran upstairs to the storage room where I then pushed the table up against the door and called the cops. As I listened and expected the two to come inside any minute, I heard a loud crash and the bars from the windows shaken aggressively. When they realized they couldn't get in, one of them let out a long, angry scream, but by the time the cops came, they were long gone. The police couldn't find out who it was, but were more active in the neighborhood in the following weeks. Regardless, I wasn't taking any more chances, and shortly after, I moved out. What irritates me is this whole time I thought I was dealing with squatters, but I'm not so sure about that anymore, because after they saw me was when they got angry and tried to break in. This is one of my only scary experiences. It happened when I was 13 or 14. I was on vacation in England with my parents, my uncle, and his then girlfriend. We rented an Airbnb in Oxford for 3 nights, and it was on the first day. We just got there, and the adults went out to buy groceries. I was tired from the trip, so I decided to stay in the apartment. It had 6 rooms with a hallway, a bathroom, a kitchen, the living room, and 2 bedrooms on the sides. My room had 2 beds, one next to the door, and the other on the other side of the room under the window and next to the radiator. So anyways, I was now alone in the flat, and I started watching horror stories ironically. I was listening with the headphones on, but they were low quality so I could kind of hear through them. So eventually, about 10 to 20 minutes after my parents left, I started to hear voices. I paused the video and the voices stopped. 30 seconds later, the video was back on, and I heard voices again. So this time, I took my headphones off. I could still hear the voices. I assumed it might have been people from another flat on the same floor, but at one point they started to knock on the door and call out hello. I was alone, I was 14 years old, and I had just watched 2 compilations of horror stories in a row. There was no way I was going to answer the door, even if it was my door being knocked on. I put the video back on, but I was uneasy, so I wasn't really listening. Instead, I was focusing on the voices. Not a minute later, I heard the front door open. It couldn't be my parents. We're not native English speakers, and that accent was too good to be theirs. Even if they were playing a prank on me, it was not their voices. So I did what any reasonable paranoid 14-year-old would have done in this scenario. I grabbed my stuff that was on the bed, my phone and my daggers, since I had one that I would always take with me on trips. I hid behind the bed in a small little area between the mattress and the wall near the radiator. Then I called my dad in tears, panicked, and whisper shouting so that he would hear me, but the intruder wouldn't know that there was someone in the apartment. Meanwhile, the intruder was opening every door and checking every room for some reason. My dad said he would be back in maybe 10 minutes, and he told me to stay hidden and quiet. Eventually, he hung up, but not 2 minutes after that, the person opened the door to my room, and I prayed that he would not walk straight towards me. And of course, with my legendary luck, he walked straight towards me. So I closed my eyes, breathed in, clutched my knife and phone, and got up, shaking. If I had to go down, I would go down fighting. When I faced him, I could just see the surprise on his face. He almost jumped when he saw me. I asked with a heavy French accent, "Who are you?" He had the audacity to answer that he was the owner of the apartment. I wasn't actually mad, I was just relieved that he was not someone trying to harm me. My dad got there like 1 minute later, during which the guy and I were still standing there, side-eyeing each other in awkward silence. I cried a lot while the guy almost cried and apologized over and over again. It turns out when we arrived, the boiler had died, and my parents called him to warn him, but managed to fix it after a while. The guy then came without warning them because he wanted to check the radiators. That's why he came straight towards me when he walked into the room I was in, because I was hiding right next to the radiator. But all is well that ends well, and now it's a funny story. This happened around late fall 2018. My parents had started traveling more for work, and every now and then I would stay at home alone in the house for about a week to watch over things. It was a quiet area, not rural, but not busy either. There were long stretches of road with only a few houses, and behind ours was a patch of trees that turned into a forest. I wasn't exactly fearless at my age. A year before, I had someone follow me while I was out running, and it stuck with me. Still, being at home usually felt fine. We had 2 large hunting dogs, and most of the neighbors kept to themselves, but looked out for anything unusual in the neighborhood. A few days before my parents left that time, someone mentioned a car being broken into a couple of streets over. It was enough to make me double-check the locks at night. My parents brushed it off, said stuff like that happens everywhere, and reminded me that we had security lights and dogs. On the 4th day of being home alone, I had to run out to grab some groceries. I went later than I should have, just before it got fully dark. The store wasn't far, so I walked, and I took the usual way back, cutting through a side street that connected to my neighborhood. On the way back, I noticed a man sitting on a bench. I didn't think much of it until I passed him and then heard footsteps behind me. At first, I assumed that he was just heading in the same direction as me. I just kept walking, trying to act normal, but I could feel him still following me. When I reached the corner near my house, I saw one of my neighbors outside taking out the trash. I walked straight towards him and said something random just to start a conversation. The footsteps behind me stopped. I glanced back quickly, and the man had already turned around, walking away fast. I told my parents later, and like usual, they told me I would be fine with the security lights and dogs. That night, I stayed downstairs with the dogs. Around midnight, everything was quiet. The dogs were lying near the couch, half asleep. I was on my phone when I heard something outside, a soft tap against the back window. A few minutes passed, then there was another tap, this time from the side of the house. Someone was going around the house to each window, tapping on it or checking if it was unlocked. I turned off the lights without thinking and just stood there, listening to the next taps. Another knock, louder this time, on the front door. I could see the door from where I stood. A shadow close enough that it blocked the streetlight was right in front of the door. The door handle shook slightly, like someone tested it. I went back into the hallway, trying not to make a noise. My phone was already in my hand. I thought about calling the police, but I called my parents instead. There was a sudden bang against the door, hard enough to make the frame creak. The dogs started barking then, loud and sharp, but they stayed close to me instead of running up to the door. Another bang on the door, and then another. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I ducked into the small laundry room and shut the door, locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. My mom picked up after a few rings finally. They could hear the banging through the line, and I told them while starting to cry that someone was trying to break into the house. The banging kept going the whole time I was on the phone, and at one point it sounded like someone hit the window next to the door. My mom told me to stay where I was and not to come out no matter what. My dad was already calling every neighbor who lived nearby, as the police would take too long to get there. After what felt like forever, I heard a car pull up outside, and then voices shouting at the man who was trying to get through the front door and window next to it. A minute later, there was a knock on the laundry room door. It was my neighbor who had a key to our house. When I came out, the front door had a dent near the handle, and the window beside it was cracked. My neighbors said they saw someone run into the backyard when they pulled up, heading towards the trees behind the house. They didn't bother to chase him in fear of being ambushed by him in the darkness back by the woods. We walked around outside later with flashlights once more neighbors arrived, and we had a big group, but there was nothing else to see. just footprints in the garden near the back fence which the intruder must have climbed over to escape into the woods. My parents didn't let me stay alone in the house after that, and always had a plan for me to have some other adult staying with me. This story happened to my mother when she was in her mid-20s, sometime around 1979 or so, just a few years before she married my dad. She was living with a friend in an apartment on a shady street in Jackson, Mississippi. Her roommate was a musician, but she was out of town for the weekend and not expected to be back until the next day on Monday. On Sunday night, my mom went to bed, and she heard some rattling in the front room. She then heard the front door open. She thought that her roommate was back. However, as seconds went by, she wondered why her roommate didn't turn on the light and why she didn't say, "I'm back." Then, as she heard things moving around in the front room, she realized that she was in desperate trouble. There was one room between her and where the burglar was. There was a back door behind my mom near the kitchen, but it's always kept locked, and she didn't have a key. Being a religious person, she began to pray. Her mind became clear, and she thought the best thing to do would be to remain still and quiet. Maybe after he got the money out of her purse, he would leave. Still praying, my mom snuggled down into the pillow, but she was so frightened that she was shaking all over. She opened one eye to see the figure of a tall, dark man coming through the doorway. He was quite tall. She knew that he had to be over 6'4", because her fiancé was that height, and this guy was taller than that when he came through the door. As he walked towards her in the room, she still thought that she would try to remain still and quiet and pretend to be asleep. He stood at the foot of her bed and looked down at her, tilting his head from side to side as if trying to see her face. She decided that this could possibly be her last few minutes on earth. She cried out to God and said, "Father, Father, Father," and screamed as loudly as she could. When she stopped screaming, she realized that the huge man had walked back out through the front room and out the front door, closing the door behind him. My mom locked the door, turned on the lights, and realized that it was not a dream. Later, she called the police and made a report on the incident. It turns out the guy who broke in got less than $10 from her purse. They asked her to identify him through small pictures which showed only faces. Not having seen his face very clearly, she could not identify him, as they all seemed very much alike. She finally chose one of them. The detective had been a teaching assistant at the University of Southern Mississippi where my mom took classes, so she knew him. He looked rather disappointed at the picture she chose and said, "I wish you should have chose the man right there," pointing at another man. He's 6'6" and was just paroled last week. He lives 2 streets down. How could she have identified him if he was not shown to her lineup, but only a small picture of his face? Nothing more came from the incident or the police report. The next week, my mom read about a similar incident several blocks away. However, the woman did not survive, and they found her body on the lawn the next day. My mom stayed with another friend for several weeks. Even though her roommate was back, she didn't feel safe there for the time being. Some friends were critical of how she handled the incident, some saying, "I don't think I would have screamed," and other stuff like that. One friend said, "Don't you see what happened when you called out 'Father, Father'? He thought there was someone else there in the house with you, causing him to leave in a hurry." That's the story of how our Heavenly Father protected my mom that night over 40 years ago.